Lucas slammed his car door shut only to find a frail little girl already sitting in the passenger seat, her small fists clenched against her knees. Her eyes burned with something far older than her years as she whispered through trembling lips, "Everyone else is picked up. Why does no one ever come for me?" In that moment, power met desperation, and his world cracked open. What would you have done? Tell me your thoughts below. I really want to hear them. Lucas Morgan had never been one to linger. His mornings were timed to the minute, his suits pressed with immaculate precision, his calendar packed with board meetings, investor calls, and strategy reviews that left no space for accident. By the time most of Paris was still stirring awake, Lucas was already moving with the calm certainty of a man who controlled entire skylines. That afternoon, after a string of calls that stretched from London to Hong Kong, he found himself in New York for a brief stopover before flying out again. The underground garage of the Waldorf Astoria was quiet as he approached his sleek black car briefcase in one hand, phone in the other, eyes still scanning through emails. He pressed the key fob, the car chirped open, and he swung the door wide with the ease of routine. But routine shattered in an instant. Sitting in the passenger seat was a little girl no older than 6, her knees drawn together, a small backpack balanced carefully on her lap. Her brown hair, slightly wavy, caught the dim light of the garage. She turned her face toward him with wide, steady eyes, and in a whisper so soft it barely rose above the hum of distant traffic, she said, "No one comes for me." For the first time in years, Lucas froze. His grip tightened instinctively around the keys. He glanced around the garage, half expecting a frantic parent to come running, or a hotel staff member with a flustered apology. But the space was empty, the polished floors stretching out into silence. The child did not move, did not flinch, did not show the slightest fear at finding herself in the car of a stranger. She simply sat calm as though she had been waiting for him. Lucas cleared his throat, his voice sharper than he intended. "How did you get in here?" The girl looked down at her lap, then back up, her gaze unnervingly steady. The door wasn't locked. She spoke plainly, without hesitation, as if the matter were self-explanatory. He should have called security. That was the logical, correct thing to do. He should have escorted her out and notified the front desk. But something about the way she sat there, too still, too practiced, like someone who had been taught not to take up space, made him pause. "What's your name?" he asked, softer this time. "Sophie," she said, "just that." Lucas exhaled slowly. "Where are your parents?" "My mother is at home. She can't come for me." There was no self-pity in her tone, only a kind of weary certainty that belonged to someone much older than 6. Against every instinct drilled into him from years of boardrooms and negotiations, Lucas crouched, slightly resting one hand against the open door. "Do you know where you live?" She nodded. "Montmartre, near the hill with the white church." The answer startled him, not the name itself, but the confidence with which she said it, as though she had memorized it for precisely this moment. The Sacré-Cœur. Lucas thought absently one of Paris's busiest landmarks, yet she spoke of it like a quiet marker of home. Lucas stood in silence, conflicted. His schedule was already impossibly tight. His flight to London left in 3 hours. He had no time for detours, no patience for disruptions, no reason to become involved in whatever this was. Yet, when he looked at Sophie again, at the small hands folded over her backpack straps, the thin yellow sweater that seemed too light for the weather, he felt something stir in his chest that he had not felt in years. "Why my car?" he asked finally. Sophie's eyes flickered toward the row of parked vehicles. Shiny sedans, tinted SUVs, luxury brands lined neatly side by side. "Because yours was open," she said again. Then, after a pause, she added, "And because you look like someone who doesn't walk away." The words landed heavier than he expected. For a long moment, Lucas said nothing. Then he straightened, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door. He could hear his own pulse in the quiet. He didn't know why he was doing this, or what sense there was in it, but he found himself turning the key in the ignition. "Tell me the address," he said. Sophie spoke softly, reciting the street name and number with deliberate care, as though she had repeated it to herself many times. It led to a neighborhood he vaguely remembered from years ago, a part of the city long absent from his maps and plans, a place he had no business in. Lucas shifted the car into gear, the sound echoing faintly through the garage. As they pulled into the busy streets of New York, Sophie sat silently beside him, her posture upright, her gaze fixed firmly on the world rushing past her window. She didn't fidget, she didn't chatter. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the muffled rhythm of the city beyond the glass. Lucas stole glances at her, struck by how unnatural her silence felt. Children were not supposed to sit so still. Children were not supposed to look so old in their eyes. At a red light, Lucas risked another question. "Sophie, does your mother know you're here?" Her small fingers tightened slightly on the strap of her backpack. "No," she said. "She's too tired." If I asked, she would have said no. He should have turned around then. He should have ended this before it grew more complicated. Yet he didn't. Instead, he pressed the accelerator when the light turned green, following directions from a 6-year-old girl into streets he had not driven in decades. The buildings grew older, the sidewalks cracked. Graffiti-covered shuttered storefronts, and the neon signs thinned into quiet lamplight. The city felt different here, slower, worn down by years of being overlooked. Lucas's luxury car looked absurdly out of place on these streets, its polished chrome reflecting walls that had not seen fresh paint in decades. Finally, Sophie lifted a hand and pointed. "There." He eased the car to a stop before a narrow building. Its bricks weathered its steps, sagging a crooked window blind, swaying faintly in the evening breeze. The kind of place the city planners had long since forgotten. Lucas shifted into park and looked at Sophie. He expected her to hop out to thank him, in the simple childlike way children often did, and run toward the door. Instead, she turned to him, her expression steady, almost formal. "Would you mind coming in? My mother has trouble getting up." For the second time that night, Lucas hesitated. Everything about this went against his instincts, his training, his guarded nature. And yet, as Sophie opened the door and stepped out with quiet certainty, she didn't look back to see if he would follow. She simply trusted that he would. Lucas sat in the driver's seat, the wheel firm beneath his hands, the city noise muffled outside. He could still turn away. He could still drive back to the world he understood, the one where control was absolute and emotions had no place. But as he watched the small figure of Sophie climb the uneven steps, her backpack bouncing lightly against her shoulders, something inside him shifted like the first crack in a wall he had spent his life building. And before he could stop himself, Lucas opened the door and stepped out. The stairwell smelled faintly of damp stone and old wood, the kind of scent that spoke of years without repair. Lucas followed Sophie up the uneven steps, each one creaking under his weight. She moved with quiet confidence, as if this crooked path had always been hers to climb, and paused only once to glance back at him as if to make sure he was still there. When they reached the second floor, she stopped before a door with peeling blue paint. She knocked once, softly, and then pushed it open. The apartment was dim, lit only by the glow of a single lamp perched on a crooked table. The wallpaper had long since curled at the edges, and the floor sagged slightly beneath Lucas's polished shoes. Yet, despite its wear, the space was neat. Dishes stacked carefully in the sink. A small pile of school books arranged in order on the corner of a wobbly desk. The faint smell of medicine hung in the air, mingled with the sweeter scent of chamomile tea. On a thin sofa pushed against the wall lay a woman. She appeared younger than Lucas expected, perhaps mid-30s, but her face was pale, her breathing shallow, her frame buried beneath a quilt that seemed too heavy for her frail body. When she turned her head toward the door, her eyes widened with the faintest flicker of alarm at seeing a suited man step into her living room. "Mom," Sophie said quickly, her voice carrying a rare hint of urgency. "This is Mr. Morgan. He brought me home." The woman struggled to sit up, her hands pressing against the sofa for support. She managed only halfway before sinking back, breath catching in her chest. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw, as though even speaking demanded strength she did not have. Lucas felt awkward standing there, briefcase still in his hand, the immaculate cut of his jacket out of place among the frayed edges of the room. He inclined his head politely. It was no trouble, he said, though. The words felt woefully insufficient. Sophie slipped out of her shoes and crossed the room to her mother's side, setting her backpack carefully on the floor. She adjusted the quilt with small, deliberate hands, checked the cup of water on the side table, and glanced at the bottle of pills resting nearby. She did not speak while she worked. She didn't need to. The way she moved, focused, efficient, steady, spoke of repetition of tasks she had performed again and again. Lucas watched, unsettled by how much responsibility seemed to rest on such small shoulders. The woman, Claire, gathered enough breath to try again. "I usually call the school if I can't make it," she said slowly. "Today, I couldn't. I didn't expect." Her gaze shifted back to him, her voice catching on the edges of embarrassment. "Anyone to help?" Lucas cleared his throat, the polite veneer of his voice softening almost against his will. "It was on my way," he said. It wasn't true, not at all, but he could not bear to let the silence stretch further. Claire nodded faintly, as if even gratitude cost her more energy than she could spare. Sophie finished with her careful adjustments, turned back toward him. Her expression was calm, but there was something almost formal in the way she asked, "Would you like some tea?" For a moment, Lucas did not know how to answer. He was not used to being offered hospitality by children. "No, thank you," he said, finally, his voice low. "You don't have to stay," Claire murmured, closing her eyes for a moment as if the effort of keeping them open had grown too heavy. "But thank you for bringing her." He should have left then. Every instinct told him so. The situation was not his to manage. He had meetings to prepare for flights, to catch numbers to review. But something held him in place. Perhaps it was the composure in Sophie's voice, so carefully practiced for someone her age. Perhaps it was the fragility in Claire's breathing. Or perhaps it was the sudden and jarring recognition of loneliness that mirrored his own, though he had buried his beneath glass towers and relentless ambition. Lucas lowered his briefcase to the floor and took a seat on the edge of a worn chair by the wall. The springs creaked beneath his weight, the sound strangely intimate in the quiet room. Sophie moved to sit beside her mother, her small hand resting gently on Claire's arm. The three of them did not speak for a while. The silence stretched, but it was not empty. It carried weight, the kind that pressed on the chest and demanded to be felt. His gaze moved around the apartment, cataloging details as he often did in boardrooms and negotiations. No television. A small electric heater buzzing softly in the corner. Bills stacked neatly on the table, some still unopened. A can of soup waiting beside them as though it were the next meal. These were not numbers on a spreadsheet. They were signs of survival, fragile and unsteady. Sophie looked up suddenly, her voice breaking the quiet. "Most people don't come inside," she said. Not accusatory, just factual, the way one might remark on the weather. "Ah." Lucas met her gaze, surprised by the maturity in her words. "And you wanted me to." She shrugged, adjusting the strap of her backpack with a small tug. You didn't look like someone who would laugh." The words cut deeper than he expected. He thought of the children he had glimpsed outside the school earlier, the way they had pointed and laughed when Sophie climbed into his car. He thought of her steady silence during the drive, her refusal to fidget or complain. He thought of how she had chosen him, not because of who he was, but because she had seen something in him he wasn't sure existed anymore. Claire's breathing grew heavier, and Sophie leaned closer to her mother, whispering something too soft for Lucas to hear. He looked away, giving them a moment of privacy, but the image lingered, a child carrying the weight of a household, a mother fighting to hold on, and himself a man who had spent his life measuring worth in profit margins and towers of steel. When he finally rose to leave, the lamp flickered faintly, casting long shadows across the worn floor. Claire opened her eyes briefly, her voice no more than a whisper. "Thank you again." Lucas nodded once words caught in his throat. Sophie walked him to the door, her footsteps quiet against the old floorboards. At the threshold, she looked up at him, her expression steady, almost solemn. "You'll come back?" she asked. He should have said no. He should have reminded her that he was not part of this world, that his life had no space for unexpected children in worn sweaters or mothers fighting unseen battles. But as he looked at her standing small yet unflinching in the doorway, the answer that left his lips was not the one he had planned. "I will," he said. And as he stepped back into the narrow hallway, the air heavy with the scent of old wood and medicine, Lucas Morgan realized he had just made a promise that would follow him far beyond these forgotten corners of Paris. Back in London, Lucas Morgan tried to bury himself in work. His office tower stretched high above the Thames, its glass walls reflecting a city that never stopped moving. Meetings filled his mornings, investor lunches bled into afternoons, and conference calls ran late into the night. On paper, his days were as productive as ever. Yet no matter how many figures he signed off on or contracts he negotiated, his thoughts drifted back to the dim apartment in Montmartre. He saw Sophie's solemn brown eyes every time he glanced up from his spreadsheets, heard the faint rattle of Claire's breathing when silence settled between conversations. It unsettled him in ways he couldn't articulate. One evening, while the city below pulsed with light, Lucas found himself standing at the window of his penthouse, drink untouched in his hand. He had spent years conditioning himself to compartmentalize, to cut off emotion when it served no purpose. But the memory of Sophie adjusting the quilt over her mother's frail body gnawed at him. He could ignore many things, competition, criticism, even personal loneliness, but not that image. He knew with a weight that surprised him that he would return. The next week, Lucas was back in Paris. He arrived without ceremony, carrying 2 bags of groceries instead of his usual briefcase. Sophie opened the door, her eyes widening briefly in surprise before softening into something else, something like relief. Claire was sitting upright this time, her breathing still shallow but steadier. She looked at the bags and tried to protest, but Lucas raised a hand. "It's not charity," he said quietly. "It's just help." From then on, his visits became more frequent. He repaired the loose hinge on the front door, replaced the flickering bulb in the hallway, stocked the kitchen with food that wouldn't spoil within days. Sometimes he brought books for Sophie, watching as her face lit up when she discovered new stories. Other times, he simply sat with Claire while she fought to catch her breath, offering her a presence that wasn't pity but respect. But word traveled fast in his world. It wasn't long before colleagues noticed his absences from late-night strategy sessions, or that his calendar suddenly had immovable blocks of time marked only as personal. At a board dinner, a partner leaned across the table, voice low, but edged with curiosity. Why is Lucas Morgan spending so much time in Montmartre? The question was laced with suspicion, as though compassion was a liability. Lucas deflected with a thin smile, unwilling to explain. He had built his career on precision and control. There was no language in his world for what he was doing now. The press caught on too. A photograph surfaced of his car parked outside the narrow street, speculation bubbling in tabloids about secret affairs or hidden investments. Lucas ignored the chatter. For the first time in years, perception no longer dictated his choices. Sophie, however, seemed acutely aware of the risk he was taking. One afternoon, as he was tightening a broken curtain rod in their living room, she stood beside him with her hands folded. "Most people leave," she said softly. "They say they'll come back, but they don't." Lucas paused, screwdriver in hand. He turned toward her, meeting her gaze. "I'm not most people." Her expression didn't change immediately. She studied him for a long moment as though measuring whether the words could be trusted. Then she nodded, once the faintest curve of a smile tugging at her lips. "I know." The simplicity of her answer carried a weight heavier than any contract he had ever signed. It wasn't an agreement made in ink, but in faith. And faith, he realized, was far harder to earn. Claire, too, noticed the shift. One evening, as Lucas replaced a faulty heater in the corner, she spoke quietly from the sofa. "You understand she's beginning to expect you now," she said, her voice fragile but steady. Lucas set the tool down, turning to face her. "Maybe she should." "She's been let down before," Claire continued, her eyes sharp despite her weakness. "Her father disappeared before she was old enough to remember him. My family faded away when I got sick. She's strong, stronger than a child should be, but strength has limits. If you walk away, it will break her." Lucas met her gaze, and for once he let down the armor he wore in every other part of his life. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. The words surprised even him, but as soon as they left his mouth he knew they were true. It wasn't duty that kept him coming back. It wasn't guilt or even pity. It was something deeper, something he could not yet name, but could feel pressing against the walls he had built around himself. A pull, steady and insistent toward responsibility that felt less like a burden and more like belonging. That night, as he left their building, the Parisian air was sharp with winter's edge. Lucas walked toward his car, his footsteps echoing against cracked pavement. For the first time in years, the thought of returning to his penthouse office tower felt hollow. He knew with a clarity that startled him his life had already shifted course. He was no longer simply a man who built skyscrapers and balanced ledgers. Somewhere between a whispered plea in the back seat of his car and the quiet dignity of a frail woman on a worn sofa, Lucas Morgan had stepped into a story larger than his own, and there was no turning back. Lucas Morgan had always guarded his personal life like a fortress, yet, little by little, Sophie had found her way inside. It began with small gestures, her quiet presence at the dinner table, the way she left drawings tucked into his briefcase, the calm expectancy with which she waited for his car each afternoon. But soon the boundaries between his two worlds blurred, until one morning he decided to bring her into the very heart of his life, his office in London. The building, with its polished marble floors and endless glass, was a far cry from the narrow streets of Montmartre. Sophie walked through the revolving doors at his side, her hand gripping the strap of her backpack. The staff stared curious but respectful, though their eyes betrayed surprise. Lucas guided her into the elevator, the hum of machinery filling the silence as they rose toward the top floor. When the doors opened, Sophie's gaze widened at the sweeping view of the Thames. The entire city stretched before her like a living map. She stayed close as he settled into his desk, but she did not fidget or demand his attention. Instead, she sat in the corner with a notepad sketching the world around her. At one point, his assistant entered with a stack of files, pausing when she saw the child in the room. "Mr. Morgan," she began cautiously. "Shall I?" "It's fine," Lucas interrupted. "She's exactly where she should be." Sophie looked up, almost startled, then gave a small nod before returning to her drawing. Later, when Lucas glanced at her page, he found she had sketched the city skyline, her pencil strokes deliberate, her perspective sharp for someone so young. "Do you like it?" he asked. "It's beautiful," she said, though her tone was measured. After a pause, she added, "But it's very quiet up here, important but lonely." Her words lingered in him long after she returned to her seat. No one, in all his years of business, had ever named the emptiness he carried so plainly. That weekend, he decided to show her a different side of his world. They flew back to London together, not for meetings, but to walk through Hyde Park in the early morning mist. Sophie fed ducks by the pond, her laughter rising in a way he had never heard before. They visited the British Museum, where she lingered over ancient artifacts with wide-eyed wonder, asking questions he had no easy answers for. At night, she sat at his table, crayons spread before her, sketching the two of them beneath landmarks she had only just seen. Lucas found himself looking forward to these moments more than any boardroom victory. But storms were gathering. Claire's health faltered again, her hospital visits becoming more frequent, her strength fading in ways that could not be ignored. Lucas arranged private consultations paid for the best specialists. Yet the reports all returned the same: her condition was worsening, her body fighting a battle it would not win. Whispers also grew louder outside their walls. Colleagues speculated about his unusual commitments. Newspapers hinted at scandals, questioning why a millionaire was spending so much time in a forgotten corner of Paris. A teacher, concerned but cautious, once asked Lucas if he was family when he came to collect Sophie from school. His answer was steady no. "But I'm who she has right now." Late one evening, as Claire lay propped against pillows, Lucas sat across from her in the dimly lit room. Sophie had already gone to bed. Claire's eyes met his weary but unflinching. "You know, she's watching you," she said, her voice faint but clear. "She's measuring every word, every choice. If you leave it, won't just break her, it will undo her." Lucas leaned forward, his hands clasped. "I'm not leaving," he said. Claire studied him for a long time before nodding, as though she had been holding on to the question for far too long. "Then you must be ready," she whispered, "because she will need more than someone who visits. She will need someone who stays." The words settled over him like a vow. That night alone in his London office, Lucas requested a legal file from his team: guardianship procedures, rights, responsibilities. He read every line with a steady heart, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. This was no longer about acts of kindness or fleeting gestures. It was about permanence, about choosing to become the anchor Sophie had never known. He knew the storm ahead would test him. Claire's illness, the scrutiny of his world, the legal complexities of becoming more than a benefactor. Yet, as he thought of Sophie's quiet trust, the way she looked at him when she asked if he would come back, Morgan understood there was no turning back. He was already bound not by obligation, but by something far stronger, the need to be the one who stayed. Claire passed quietly on a Sunday morning in early October. The air outside carried the first bite of autumn, the kind of chill that hinted winter was not far away. Lucas had taken Sophie to the park when the call came, and by the time they reached the hospital, her mother was already gone. She lay still, her face softened into peace as though she had simply fallen into sleep. Sophie sat beside the bed, holding her mother's hand with a composure no child should be forced to carry. She did not cry at first. She whispered something only the two of them could share, words Lucas would never hear, but knew carried the weight of a final goodbye. The funeral was small, attended by a few nurses, a teacher from Sophie's school, and one neighbor who remembered Claire from years past. Lucas arranged everything, ensuring that dignity wrapped every detail, because Claire had lived with quiet grace, and deserved nothing less. Sophie stood beside him, clutching a single white rose, her hand gripping his so tightly that his knuckles ached. He did not let go. Life shifted swiftly after that. Lucas moved Sophie into his London apartment not as a guest, but as family. Her bed from Paris was carried up into a room with wide windows overlooking the city, her books lined neatly on shelves he had installed himself, her little yellow lamp glowing softly by her bedside. What had once been a sterile penthouse now filled with the sound of her footsteps, the clink of cereal bowls in the kitchen, the murmur of her voice as she practiced reading aloud. Lucas discovered that mornings were no longer about rushing to the office, but about walking Sophie to school, listening as she recounted dreams or worried over spelling tests. These rituals grounded him in a way no contract or quarterly report ever had. Legal guardianship was finalized within weeks. The process, expedited by Claire's written declaration and medical reports, moved faster than expected. Lucas sat in the quiet of his office as the judge's stamped order was placed before him. It was a simple piece of paper, yet when he held it, something heavy shifted inside him. It was not an acquisition or a deal. It was a promise. For the first time, his signature bound him not to investors or cities, but to a child's future. He told Sophie that evening. She was coloring at the table when he sat beside her, the document folded neatly in his hand. "Sophie," he said gently, "it's official. You'll stay with me now, always. You're safe." Her pencil paused mid-stroke. For a moment, she did not look up. Then, in a voice quieter than a whisper, she asked, "Does that mean you're really my dad now?" Lucas's throat tightened. He could have said yes, could have leaned on the legal truth. But instead, he said, "I'm whatever you need me to be. And I'll be that for as long as you'll let me." She turned, then, studying his face with a seriousness beyond her years. Slowly, she placed her small hand on his arm. "I want you to be my dad," she said. "You already are." The words broke something open in him that had been locked away for decades. He pulled her close, her slight frame folding into his embrace, and for the first time, Lucas Morgan allowed himself to believe that family was not only something you were born into, but something you chose, something you built. The weeks that followed were not easy. Grief lingered in quiet corners of their new life. Sometimes Sophie woke in the night, her eyes wet with tears, her voice trembling, as she asked if her mother could see her. Lucas never deflected. He told her the truth, that love like Claire's did not vanish. It remained in memories, in laughter, in the habits Sophie carried. Together they learned how to carry loss, not as a weight that crushed, but as a bond that endured. Christmas came with small rituals they created together. Sophie insisted on buying ornaments from a tiny shop near Covent Garden, each one mismatched but carefully chosen. They decorated a modest tree in the corner of the living room, the golden star at the top slightly crooked but perfect in its imperfection. On Christmas Eve, Sophie handed him a small box. Inside was a keychain engraved with a single word, Dad. On the other side it read, "Always. I saved for it," she said quickly, almost nervously. "I know it's not much." Lucas didn't let her finish. He knelt, pulling her into his arms, holding her tighter than he ever had before. "It's the best gift I've ever received," he whispered. And he meant it. That night, as the lights of the tree blinked softly and the city hummed beyond the windows, Lucas sat with Sophie curled against his side. The penthouse no longer felt empty, no longer echoed with the sterile quiet of success. It felt alive, full of presence, full of meaning. He thought back to the moment in the garage when a little girl had whispered, "No one comes for me." He remembered the shock, the hesitation, the choice he almost didn't make. Now, with her small hand resting in his, he understood that choice had rewritten his life. Lucas Morgan had built towers of glass and steel that touched the sky, but none of them compared to what he was building now. A family. A life rooted not in wealth or status, but in love that showed up day after day without condition. And as he looked down at Sophie's peaceful face, he knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be, not a millionaire CEO, not a man defined by empire, but a father. From the moment Lucas Morgan opened his car door and found Sophie sitting silently in his passenger seat, his life began to shift in ways he never could have imagined. He was a man who built towers-shaped skylines and commanded respect in boardrooms across the world, yet none of those achievements prepared him for the quiet resilience of a 6-year-old girl who whispered, "No one comes for me." That single sentence cracked open the walls he had spent years constructing around himself. What followed was not a story of instant transformation, but one of steady, deliberate change. Lucas stepped into Sophie's fragile world in Montmartre, where peeling wallpaper and stacks of unpaid bills spoke louder than words. There, he met Claire, a mother fighting illness with dignity and strength, and he witnessed the extraordinary weight Sophie carried at such a young age. Small gestures, groceries, fixing a broken door, arranging medical care slowly evolved into something larger. He was no longer a visitor. He was becoming part of their lives. The journey tested him. Colleagues and newspapers questioned his choices, asking why a millionaire CEO would spend his time in forgotten corners of Paris. Yet Lucas discovered that true value isn't defined by perception. It is defined by presence. He chose to show up to keep his promises, and in doing so he became someone Sophie could finally trust. When Claire's health declined, he did not walk away. He pursued guardianship, ensuring Sophie would never be left to the uncertainty of the system. And when Claire passed, Lucas kept his vow: Sophie would never face the world alone. By the time Christmas came, the sterile silence of his penthouse had been replaced by Sophie's laughter, by the sound of crayons scratching across paper, by small rituals, like decorating a crooked tree. When she handed him a keychain engraved with the word "Dad," Lucas understood that his greatest achievement was not in skyscrapers or contracts, but in the quiet miracle of chosen family. This story offers a profound lesson. The real measure of a life well lived is not in wealth or titles, but in the courage to stay when it would be easier to walk away. We all face moments when someone, child, friend, colleague, or stranger, needs us to be steady to show up again and again. It is in those choices that love is proven. Lucas's journey reminds us that compassion and responsibility have the power to transform not only the lives of others, but our own. So ask yourself, where are you being called to show up? Who in your life needs not just your words, but your consistent presence? These are the questions that shape legacies far more lasting than buildings or balance sheets. If this story touched you, I'd love to hear your reflections in the comments. Your thoughts may inspire someone else who needs to be reminded of the power of showing up. And if you want to support more stories like this, please subscribe to the channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating meaningful content that reminds us all what truly matters.